A millionaire meets a poor mother and her 2 children at the cemetery when she visits her husband. They are then surprised to discover that their loved ones passed away on the same day. And then, a secret is revealed. Daniel Livingston tightened his grip on the steering wheel as his black SUV cut through the thick layers of snow, the wipers swiping mechanically against the relentless flurry. The sky hung low, heavy with the weight of winter, casting a grey pallor over everything. He didn't need the GPS to navigate to Greenwood Cemetery. His hands turned the wheel out of habit, guiding him through the winding roads that led to a place he both longed for and dreaded. The iron gates loomed ahead, their edges lined with frost. He pulled into the nearly deserted lot, shutting off the engine. Silence settled over him, thick and unyielding. He exhaled, his breath a ghostly mist in the frigid air, then reached for the bouquet of white roses lying on the passenger seat. Their petals were pristine, untouched by the cold, unlike the memories that clung to him, frayed, worn, and yet painfully intact. He stepped out, the crunch of his boots against the snow the only sound accompanying him. The cemetery stretched before him in endless rows of headstones, half buried beneath nature's quiet assault. The wind howled, a lonely, hollow sound, as he trudged forward. Charlotte's grave was easy to find. He had walked this path too many times. The polished marble headstone bore her name, delicate and precise, etched into eternity. Charlotte Livingston, beloved wife. Nothing more, nothing less. He knelt, brushing away the thin layer of fresh snow that had gathered on the stone, his fingers lingering over the carved letters. "Hi, my darling," he murmured, voice barely above a whisper. The words felt hollow, lost against the vastness of the cold. He placed the roses gently against the base of the headstone, their stark white blending seamlessly with the snow. The silence between them had always been comfortable, even when she was alive. Now it was unbearable. A sound, soft, barely there, carried through the air, tugging him from his thoughts. He turned, instinctively scanning the cemetery. A few rows away, near an older section of the grounds, 3 figures huddled together in the snow. A woman and 2 children, their forms partially obscured by the storm. Daniel hadn't expected anyone else to be here in this weather. His brows furrowed as he observed them. The woman, wrapped in a thick wool coat, knelt in front of a headstone, her hands gently brushing away the snow as she spoke softly to the 2 boys beside her. The children, bundled in mismatched scarves and mittens, mirrored her movements, placing something, a small bouquet of wildflowers, against the grave. The wind carried snippets of their conversation. "We should go now, Mom," one of the boys said, shifting from foot to foot, his breath coming out in hurried puffs. "It's getting colder." The woman's voice was calm but weary. "Just a little longer," she said. "Say what you want to say to Dad." Daniel didn't mean to intrude, but something about the scene held him in place. The way the woman's shoulders curled inward, as if shielding herself from more than just the cold. The way the boys fidgeted, their young faces half hidden by their scarves, yet still carrying something unmistakable. Grief, small and uncertain, but present all the same. His gaze drifted down to the headstone they surrounded, and his breath hitched slightly. Gerald Carter. He didn't recognize the name. It was not placed beside Charlotte's, but they still are neighbors. His thoughts flickered with curiosity before he pushed it aside. This wasn't his place. The wind picked up, sharp and biting. The younger boy, perhaps no older than 6, shivered violently, his teeth chattering despite the layers he wore. The woman, noticing this, pulled him closer, rubbing his arms. Then, the words that made Daniel pause. "Mom, when can we go home?" the older boy asked, his voice strained. The woman let out a slow breath. "We can't. The trains aren't running because of the storm." Daniel's fingers tightened around his coat. He hadn't even considered the possibility of being stranded. He had a vehicle, a home waiting for him. They had neither. The woman hesitated, glancing around as if looking for options that didn't exist. "We'll find something," she reassured them, but even Daniel could hear the uncertainty in her voice. He exhaled, tilting his head back to stare at the thick clouds overhead. He wasn't the kind of man to involve himself in the lives of strangers. He was used to calculated decisions and logical choices. But standing there, in that desolate cemetery, watching a grieving woman and her children face an uncertain night in a storm, something shifted. Daniel stepped forward before he could overthink it. "You shouldn't stay out here much longer," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them. The woman startled, looking up sharply. Her gaze met his, dark eyes, guarded yet tired, filled with a quiet kind of strength. Her children turned to him as well, blinking in wary curiosity. Daniel gestured toward the snowfall. "There's a cafe not far from here. Warm food, a place to sit. If you want, I can take you there." She hesitated, studying him. He wasn't sure what she saw. A well-dressed man in a tailored wool coat, standing amidst the snow, with a polished sadness in his eyes. A stranger. She glanced down at her children, then back at him. "Why?" she asked. The honesty in her voice caught him off guard. He considered lying, making it seem like a casual offer, but instead he found himself saying, "Because no one should be out in a storm like this, especially with women and children." A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, she nodded. Daniel stepped aside, waiting as she murmured something to the boys, who exchanged glances before grabbing onto her coat. As they followed him toward his car, their footprints left fragile imprints in the fresh snow. The storm showed no signs of stopping, neither did whatever had just begun. The hum of the heater filled the small cafe, its warmth a stark contrast to the bitter cold pressing against the frosted windows. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread wrapped around them like an embrace, chasing away the chill that had settled in their bones. The cafe itself was quiet, just a few patrons hunched over steaming cups, shoulders heavy with the weight of winter. Daniel sat across from Linda and the two boys, his fingers curled loosely around the ceramic mug in front of him. He hadn't touched his coffee. The heat pressed against his palms, but his mind was elsewhere, still lingering in the cemetery, still replaying the moment he saw them standing by Gerald's grave. The boys, Roy and Joe, tore into their sandwiches, their small hands barely able to hold the thick slices of bread. Their faces, once pinched with cold, were now flushed with warmth. Occasionally, Roy would glance up at Daniel as if gauging the presence of this stranger who had unexpectedly entered their day. Linda, however, remained cautious. She kept her back straight, her hands wrapped around her cup, eyes darting between her children and Daniel. The flickering candlelight on the table cast soft shadows across her face, making the exhaustion there more apparent. "You're kind," she said at last, her voice measured. "But we don't usually accept things from strangers." Daniel met her gaze, expression unreadable. "Then it's a good thing I won't be a stranger for long." Joe, still chewing, perked up. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he said, glancing between them. "Daniel Livingston." Linda hesitated, then nodded. "Linda Matthews, and these are my boys, Roy and Joe." Joe swallowed hurriedly and grinned. "I'm 6. Roy wiped crumbs from his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm 8. Daniel almost smiled at the way Roy emphasized the extra years, as if they made all the difference in the world. "Nice to meet you both." Joe tilted his head. "Are you a dad?" Linda's hand tightened slightly around her mug. The question was innocent, but Daniel felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a slow-moving ache. "No," he answered, his voice quieter now. "I never had kids." Roy furrowed his brow, as if this was an unexpected response. "But you had a wife." Daniel inhaled slowly, letting his fingers trace the rim of his cup. "I did." He paused, choosing his words carefully. She passed away 2 years ago. A beat of silence stretched between them. Linda exhaled, barely a whisper of breath. "Today?" she asked, almost reluctantly. Daniel nodded. Something flickered in her eyes, not quite pity, not quite surprise. More like recognition, as if she understood without needing further explanation. She lowered her gaze, her thumb running absently over the rim of her cup. "My husband, Gerald," she said after a moment. "He died 2 years ago too. Same day." Daniel looked up sharply. "What happened?" She let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Car accident. Just like that. He was gone." The weight of coincidence settled between them, heavy and undeniable. Neither of them spoke, but the silence carried meaning. Loss had a way of making strangers familiar. Outside, the snowfall had thickened. The cafe windows were now frosted over, blurring the outlines of buildings and street lamps. A news report played quietly from the television above the counter, the scrolling ticker confirming what they already suspected. Train services remained suspended due to the worsening storm. Linda glanced at her boys, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "We need to figure something out," she murmured. "I didn't plan for this." Daniel studied her for a moment. The tension in her posture, the way her shoulders held the weight of too many burdens. "I have a place nearby," he said finally. "You're welcome to stay until the storm clears." Her head snapped up, suspicion flickering in her eyes. "We don't need—" "I'm not offering out of pity," Daniel cut in, his tone even. "Just practicality. The roads are bad. The boys need to rest. And frankly, the only other option is a freezing train station. Moreover, our spouses are considered neighbors, so we can help each other." Joe turned to his mother, eyes wide. "Mom, can we? Please?" Roy, usually more reserved, nudged her sleeve. "I don't want to sleep in the station." Linda's jaw tightened. She was weighing her options, measuring the risks. Daniel didn't blame her. He was a stranger after all. But then she looked at her boys, their small hands clutching at her coat, their faces still ruddy from the cold. She let out a slow breath. "All right," she said finally. "Just for the night." Joe beamed. Roy exhaled, relieved. Daniel finished the last sip of his now lukewarm coffee. "Let's go then," he said, standing and shrugging on his coat. As they stepped outside, the cold hit them instantly, sharp and unforgiving. The wind howled through the streets, kicking up swirls of snow that blurred the city lights. Linda pulled the boys closer to her side, her breath visible in the icy air. Daniel turned toward the parking lot, leading the way. He didn't know why he had made the offer, or what exactly he expected from this strange evening. But as he glanced back and saw the three of them walking just a step behind him, their footprints overlapping in the snow, he had the oddest feeling that maybe, just maybe, they weren't meant to be strangers after all. The drive through the snow-covered streets was silent, except for the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and the occasional hum of the heater working to stave off the cold. The city, usually alive with movement, had been subdued by the storm, its streets nearly deserted, its buildings shadowed under the weight of thick snowfall. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. The boys sat in the back seat, their energy subdued by exhaustion, their heads bobbing slightly as sleep threatened to overtake them. Linda sat beside him, her posture rigid, her fingers clenched in her lap. He could feel her hesitance, the unease of stepping into a stranger's home. When they finally arrived, Daniel pulled into the driveway of a tall, modern house, its large glass windows reflecting the pale glow of streetlights. The home stood in stark contrast to the warmth it lacked inside. He pushed open the car door, stepping out into the crisp night air, and moved to retrieve the boys' small bags. Linda hesitated before doing the same, glancing up at the imposing house before her. Inside, the warmth was immediate, but it carried no sense of comfort. The air smelled clean, sterile almost, as if the house had been lived in, but never truly inhabited. Linda's gaze swept across the open living room, where sleek, minimalistic furniture occupied the space like artifacts rather than possessions of sentimental value. But what caught her attention were the photos, lining the walls, resting on bookshelves, sitting on the grand piano near the staircase, frames of Charlotte, her presence frozen in time. A woman with soft, kind eyes, captured in moments that were meant to last forever. Some photos were of her alone, others of her with Daniel, their smiles untouched by the shadow of what was to come. Linda swallowed and turned away. The boys, however, were unfazed by the ghosts that lingered within these walls. Joe was the first to step forward, his small hands trailing over the polished wooden banister as he peered curiously into the unfamiliar space. Roy followed, his gaze flickering over the shelves, the books, the pristine countertops, everything untouched, undisturbed. Daniel watched them, something unreadable crossing his face before he gestured toward the hallway. "There are 2 guest rooms upstairs," he said. "You can take whichever one you want." Linda nodded, murmuring a quiet thanks, and led the boys toward the stairs. Their footsteps were light against the hardwood, their whispers fading as they disappeared into the hallway. Daniel lingered for a moment, before shrugging off his coat and heading toward the kitchen. He hadn't planned on hosting guests, but it felt natural to move, to busy his hands, to do something other than stand in the center of his too-empty home. By the time Linda returned, her boys settled and asleep, she found him in the dining room, setting plates on the table. A quiet dinner had never been part of the plan, but neither of them seemed eager to return to silence just yet. She hesitated before taking a seat. "You don't have to do all this," Daniel shrugged, settling into his own chair. "It's just food." The meal was simple, nothing extravagant, nothing overly planned. But to Linda, it was the first real dinner she had eaten in weeks, without the weight of financial worry pressing against her ribs. The warmth of the soup, the scent of fresh bread, the way steam curled from the surface of their cups. It was the kind of comfort she had long forgotten. For a while they ate in silence, the fire crackling in the nearby hearth. Then, unexpectedly, Linda spoke. "I left town after Gerald died," she said, her voice measured, distant. "We didn't have much, but the house held too many memories, too much history I couldn't bear to wake up to every morning." Daniel glanced at her but didn't interrupt. "I thought moving away would make things easier," she continued, tracing the rim of her cup with her thumb. "But I was wrong. Starting over is hard when you have nothing to start with." Daniel leaned back slightly, considering her words. "I get that," he murmured after a moment. "After Charlotte passed, I buried myself in work. I thought if I kept moving, kept filling my time with distractions, I wouldn't feel the emptiness. But it doesn't work like that." Linda exhaled softly. "Number, it doesn't." They didn't need to elaborate. Loss had a way of speaking in the spaces between words, in the quiet pauses, in the way 2 people who had never met before could recognize the same grief in each other's eyes. The fire flickered, its glow dancing against the glass windows. Outside, the snow continued to fall, layering the world in white, covering the roads, the rooftops, the footprints they had left behind. For the first time in a long while, the house didn't feel quite so empty. The storm continued its relentless siege on the city. Snow piled higher against windows, and the world outside remained locked in an eerie silence, the streets empty, the sky a swirling mass of white. Inside Daniel's house, time moved differently. The first morning was quiet. Linda woke early, expecting the discomfort of sleeping in a stranger's home to have kept her restless, but she had slept deeply. For the first time in what felt like months, exhaustion had given way to something else. Stillness. She padded down the grand staircase cautiously, half expecting to find the house in the same rigid, museum-like state as the night before. But the smell of coffee reached her first. The kitchen was already occupied. Daniel stood by the counter, one hand around a steaming mug, the other flipping through the morning news on his phone. He glanced up when she entered. "Coffee?" Linda hesitated before nodding. "Please." He poured a cup and slid it across the counter. They didn't exchange pleasantries, just sipped in silence, the kind that wasn't unfriendly, just unfamiliar. Upstairs, the boys were beginning to stir, their muffled voices traveling through the halls. It wasn't long before they thundered down the steps, their hesitation from the previous night all but forgotten. From then on, something shifted. Days passed, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. Roads were buried, public transport remained suspended, and the city all but disappeared beneath the relentless snowfall. They were stuck. And yet, instead of the unease Linda had expected, a quiet rhythm began to form. Roy and Joe adapted quickly. By the second day, the initial stiffness of being in a stranger's house faded, replaced by the uninhibited energy only children seemed to possess. They explored cautiously at first, then boldly, racing down hallways, peering into bookshelves, pressing their faces against the frosted windows to watch the storm. Joe took a liking to the piano in the corner of the living room, pressing the keys experimentally before plopping down on the bench. Roy, more reserved, took his time studying the house, running his fingers over the spines of books, examining the family photos on the walls with a quiet curiosity. Linda watched as Daniel softened around them. At first, he observed from a distance, accustomed to solitude, unsure of how to navigate the sudden presence of two children in his space. But the boys were persistent in their ability to weave themselves into someone's world. Joe dragged him into impromptu games, delighted when Daniel, albeit reluctantly, humored him. Roy asked him questions about books, about the city, and about the massive telescope that sat unused in the upstairs study. One evening, Joe shoved a pillow at Daniel, grinning. "You don't laugh a lot," he declared, as if it were an offense. "Do you ever have fun?" Linda had expected Daniel to brush it off, but instead, he leaned back on the couch, raising an eyebrow. "I do," he said simply. "I just don't show it as much as you do." Joe squinted at him, as if trying to figure out whether that was true. Linda, standing in the doorway, watched the exchange unfold. It was subtle, the way Daniel had changed since their arrival. He still carried himself with that same reserved air, but there was something less rigid about it now, like an old wound that no longer ached as much as it used to. And then, one night, when the boys had finally exhausted themselves into sleep, Linda and Daniel found themselves alone by the fire. The flames crackled softly, the only sound in the otherwise quiet house. Neither of them spoke at first, but it wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that settled comfortably between two people who understood that not everything needed to be said. Linda pulled her legs up onto the couch, her fingers wrapped around a cup of tea. "They like you," she said after a while. Daniel glanced at her, his own drink untouched in his hands. "They're good kids." She nodded, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her skin. "They don't let people in easily. After Gerald, it was hard for them to understand why he was gone." Daniel remained quiet, waiting. Linda exhaled slowly. "For a long time, I didn't know how to be enough for them. I still don't. It's like, there's this weight I carry, and no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to put it down." Daniel studied the fire for a moment before speaking. "I think," he said slowly, "that sometimes we don't have to put it down. We just have to learn how to carry it differently." She turned to him, surprised. His gaze didn't meet hers, but there was something raw in the way his fingers curled around his glass, in the way his voice had softened. "Losing someone leaves holes in places you don't even realize," he murmured. "I kept thinking if I ignored them long enough, they'd close on their own." Linda's throat tightened. "Did they?" He let out a quiet breath. "No." Neither of them had spoken of their spouses since the first night. There was no need, because grief was a language in itself, because loss was something that settled between them without ever having to be explained. The fire burned lower, its embers glowing faintly against the dim-lit room. Outside, the snow continued its descent, slow and steady, blanketing the world in an endless stretch of white. For the first time in years, neither of them felt completely alone. The storm still hadn't let up. It stretched on, relentless and unyielding, wrapping the world in layers of quiet, endless white. The snow had climbed halfway up the windows, turning them into frosted barriers between the warmth of the house and the silent, buried city outside. Inside, life moved at an unfamiliar pace. The boys had claimed the space as their temporary playground, their laughter bouncing off the high ceilings, filling the house with a lightness that hadn't been there in years. Linda had settled into a quiet routine, cooking meals, helping the boys with their schoolwork, watching the way Daniel's guarded edges softened as the days passed. On the fourth afternoon, while Linda busied herself in the kitchen, Roy and Joe wandered upstairs, their curiosity leading them toward the one place they hadn't yet explored, Daniel's study. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, the room was different from the rest of the house. While the living areas felt curated, like a space waiting to be occupied, the study had the quiet messiness of a room that belonged to someone. Papers stacked on the mahogany desk, a half-empty whiskey glass left near a collection of books, a telescope angled toward the window, as if once, long ago, someone had been waiting to look at the stars. Joe, always the braver of the two, darted forward first. "Look at all the books," he whispered, though there was no real reason to keep his voice low. Roy trailed after him, his fingers skimming the spines of books, pausing on one that had gold lettering embossed on the cover. But it was the wooden shelf in the corner that caught his attention. A row of albums stacked neatly, their spines worn from years of handling. He pulled one out, his small hand struggling slightly with the weight of it. Joe, noticing, scrambled to help. Together, they heaved it onto the floor, flipping it open. The first page was filled with pictures of Daniel, younger, standing beside a woman with dark hair and soft eyes. "This must be his wife," Roy murmured. Joe squinted at the images, his small fingers tracing over a particularly beautiful photo of Charlotte, standing on a beach, wind in her hair, a soft smile on her lips. But something else caught his attention. His breath hitched. "Wait!" Joe suddenly blurted, pointing at the picture with wide eyes. "She has Dad's necklace." Roy frowned, leaning in. "What?" Joe jabbed his finger at the chain resting against Charlotte's collarbone. It was small, but distinct, an intricate silver crescent moon wrapped around a tiny, shimmering star. "That's the same necklace Dad used to wear," Joe insisted. "Exactly the same." Downstairs, Linda heard the commotion. "Boys," she called, setting down the dish towel. When they didn't respond, she sighed, wiping her hands before making her way up the stairs. The moment she stepped into the study, Roy turned to her, excitement written across his face. "Mom, look," he said, dragging the album toward her. Linda barely had time to scold them for rummaging through things that weren't theirs before Joe was pulling at her sleeve, pointing at the picture. She glanced down, expecting some innocent discovery, but the moment her eyes landed on the necklace, she froze. Her breath caught in her throat. It was unmistakable. The crescent moon, the tiny star, the delicate way the chain looped around itself. Gerald had worn an identical one. She had seen it every day for years. It had been one of the only things of his she had kept, tucked safely in a box of belongings she couldn't yet bear to part with. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached out, tracing the photograph as if touching it would make sense of what she was seeing. "What's wrong?" Roy asked, frowning at her sudden change in expression. Linda didn't answer. She turned, her gaze searching the doorway, where Daniel now stood, silent. He must have heard their voices, or maybe he had sensed something shifting, something unraveling in the stillness of the house. His eyes flickered to the photo in her hands. For a moment, There was only silence. Then, without a word, Daniel turned and walked away. Linda hesitated only a second before following. She found him in his bedroom, kneeling beside a sleek wooden dresser, pulling open a drawer that had clearly not been touched in a long time. And then he took something out. A small silver chain, its pendant gleaming faintly in the dim light. A crescent moon. A tiny star. Linda's heart pounded. Daniel held it in his palm, staring down at it like it was something foreign, something he had never really looked at before. Then slowly, he lifted his head to meet her gaze. Her voice was barely a whisper. Gerald had one just like that. Daniel exhaled sharply, gripping the necklace tighter. Charlotte wore this all the time. I never questioned where she got it. His voice was steady, but something dark flickered beneath the surface, something Linda couldn't yet name. Her hands curled into fists, because this wasn't just a coincidence. Coincidences didn't make your stomach churn. They didn't make your skin prickle with an unspoken sense of dread. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her voice even. I still have Gerald's. Daniel's fingers tightened around the chain. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his posture that had changed. Something sharper, more alert. For the first time since they met, Linda saw something flicker in his eyes that wasn't grief. It was suspicion. The storm howled outside, pressing against the windows, sealing them in. For the first time in days, the warmth of the house felt suffocating. The house, once a reluctant sanctuary from the storm, now felt like a suffocating cage. The fire still burned in the hearth, but its warmth no longer reached Linda's skin. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked the boys into bed, their small, oblivious faces peaceful in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. "Mom?" Joe's voice was thick with sleep. "Are we still staying tomorrow?" Linda swallowed hard. She forced a smile, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "We'll see, sweetheart. Go to sleep." Joe hummed in response, already drifting, while Roy shifted slightly but didn't wake. Linda lingered for a moment, watching the steady rise and fall of their chests, grounding herself in their presence, before she finally turned off the lamp and slipped out of the room. The hallway stretched before her, dimly lit, impossibly silent. Daniel was waiting downstairs. She knew without needing to check. She found him where she expected, standing near the fireplace, his posture stiff, hands clenched at his sides. The necklace was still in his palm, his thumb absently tracing over the delicate curve of the crescent moon. He didn't look up as she approached, but the tension in his shoulders made it clear he was waiting for her. Linda didn't know what to say. There were no words for whatever this was, the unease curling deep in her stomach, the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them. She exhaled, folding her arms tightly across her chest. "Gerald never took his off," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter than she wanted it to be. "He always said it was special, but I never thought to ask why." Daniel finally looked at her then, his expression unreadable. Charlotte said the same thing. His grip on the chain tightened. "She wore it almost every day. I never thought twice about it. She had a lot of jewelry." Linda swallowed. The implications settled like lead in her stomach, a slow, creeping sickness. She rubbed her arms, suddenly cold despite the fire behind her. It could still be a coincidence. Daniel's jaw tensed. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then slowly, he exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "I don't believe in coincidences." Neither did she. But she wanted to. She wanted this to be nothing more than a strange, meaningless connection, something they could brush off, forget, move past. Because if it wasn't... Linda pressed a hand to her forehead, squeezing her eyes shut for a brief second. Daniel, still gripping the necklace, turned abruptly and strode across the room. She blinked, watching as he reached for his phone on the kitchen counter, his movements deliberate, sharp. Her stomach twisted. "Who are you calling?" He barely hesitated before responding. "Someone who can tell me the truth." Daniel had called his friend, an expert in fine jewelry authentication, an old college acquaintance who had made a career out of tracking rare and custom pieces. Now they were waiting. Does this situation make you both angry and sympathetic? If so, leave a comment, potato, below. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second stretching unbearably long. And then, the phone rang. Daniel snatched it up immediately, pressing it to his ear. "Peter." Linda could barely hear the words spoken on the other end, but she saw the shift in Daniel's posture, the tightening of his shoulders, the way his fingers curled around the edge of the kitchen counter. He didn't say a word for a long time, just listened. Then, slowly, his grip on the phone slackened. His expression changed, something between understanding and something darker, something Linda didn't want to name. He exhaled sharply. "You're sure?" Another pause. Then finally, he muttered a quiet, "Yeah, thanks." The call ended. Linda sat frozen, watching him. What did he say? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He placed the phone down carefully, as if his hands no longer trusted themselves. He let out a slow breath, his voice flat, almost detached. "The necklace," he said, holding it up between his fingers, watching it catch the firelight. "It was never sold in stores. It wasn't mass-produced." Linda's stomach twisted. "Then what?" "It was custom-made," Daniel cut in, his tone sharp. "Designed specifically as a matching set, meant for a pair." Linda's breath caught in her throat. His next words hit like a knife. They were made for lovers. The weight of the truth crashed down, suffocating. Linda shook her head, gripping the edge of the table as if the world had suddenly tilted. "No." Daniel's voice was quiet, but there was no room for doubt. "It makes sense, doesn't it?" He turned the necklace over in his palm, his jaw tight. "Charlotte had this for as long as I can remember. You said Gerald never took his off." Linda pressed a hand against her stomach, as if that could steady the nausea rising inside her. "That doesn't mean—" "It means everything," Daniel said, his voice rough. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was undeniable. "Linda, if these were made as a set, then there's only one explanation." She didn't want to hear it, didn't want to say it, didn't want to believe that the two people they had loved, the two people they had mourned, had carried pieces of each other in plain sight, as if it had been some cruel joke they hadn't known they were a part of. "They were together," Linda whispered, the words barely making it past her lips. Daniel said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Outside, the storm howled, sealing them in with the truth. The house felt like a time bomb. Days passed in unbearable silence, each one heavier than the last. The air between Daniel and Linda was thick with unspoken truths, a tension neither of them dared to address. They avoided each other's eyes, moving through the house like strangers occupying the same space. For the sake of the boys, they pretended. Roy and Joe, oblivious to the storm raging beneath the surface, continued to fill the house with their laughter and chatter, running down hallways, pleading for another round of hot cocoa, curling up by the fireplace with their books. Linda forced smiles, answered their questions, and tucked them in at night. But the weight of the unknown pressed down on her like a hand around her throat. Daniel barely spoke. He busied himself with small tasks, tending the fire, answering emails, pretending to read. But Linda could see the way his hands tightened around his coffee cup, how his shoulders remained rigid, even in moments of stillness. They were both waiting. Then, one evening, the call came. Daniel answered before the second ring, his voice clipped and sharp. "Tell me what you found." Linda, standing just a few feet away, held her breath. The voice on the other end, Elliot, the investigator Daniel had hired, spoke quickly and efficiently, and then the world cracked open. Gerald and Charlotte had been seeing each other for over a year. Linda's knees nearly buckled. Daniel gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. What? Affair started around 13 months before their deaths, Elliot continued, unbothered by the devastation in his voice. Mostly met at hotels in the city, the same ones, booked under different names. Bank statements show multiple transactions, dinners, weekend trips, private getaways, not exactly discreet. Linda sat down heavily in the chair across from Daniel's desk. Her head was spinning, a sickening wave of realization crashing over her. This doesn't make sense, she whispered. Gerald was always home. He was with the boys. Maybe he was. And maybe he was with her when he wasn't. Elliot's voice remained clinical and detached. There's more. Daniel clenched his jaw. Go on. The necklaces. They were commissioned by Charlotte. She placed the order 6 months into the affair. Had them custom made by a high-end jeweler in New York. Cost a small fortune. Linda pressed a hand to her stomach, trying to suppress the nausea clawing its way up her throat. Daniel's voice was barely controlled. The night of the accident? Elliot exhaled. They were together. The words landed like a death blow. A file appeared in Daniel's inbox within seconds. A detailed timeline, receipts and transaction records. Undeniable proof. Linda barely glanced at it before turning away, unable to stomach the betrayal laid out so plainly before her. Daniel stared at the screen, unmoving. His hands trembled slightly as he scrolled through the evidence, his breathing controlled but shallow. They were in the car together, Elliot continued, his tone shifting slightly, as if sensing the unraveling taking place on the other end of the line. They left a hotel about an hour before the accident. Security footage confirms it. They got into Charlotte's car. They were heading back when... Enough, Daniel cut him off, his voice tight, choked. Silence hung between them. Elliot cleared his throat. I'm sorry, man. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. Daniel didn't respond. He ended the call. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, Linda let out a shaky breath. We mourned them. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. We grieved them, Daniel. Daniel closed his eyes, his grip still locked around the edge of the desk. We spent 2 years missing them, Linda continued, her voice rising with every word. We thought they were the love of our lives, and the entire time they... She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth, forcing herself to breathe. Daniel let out a bitter, humorless laugh. We built them into saints. Linda shook her head, hot tears burning at the corners of her eyes. I feel sick. That day I was so hurt that I forgot to look back to see whose car he was in, where he was going, and what he was doing before the accident happened. I naively thought that maybe a colleague, a partner, or any other innocent relationship. I was such an idiot. Daniel finally looked at her, his expression unreadable. What do we do with this, Linda? She met his gaze, eyes filled with the same devastation, the same anger, the same loss. She had no answer. Outside, the snow kept falling. The suitcase sat open on the bed, half filled, the zipper unfastened as if waiting for Linda to change her mind. She wouldn't. She couldn't stay. The house, once a reluctant sanctuary from the storm, had become suffocating. Every wall, every hallway, every echo of laughter from Roy and Joe now felt tainted. The warmth that had slowly seeped into this place over the last week had been stripped away, leaving behind something hollow, something fractured beyond repair. Linda folded a sweater, her fingers moving mechanically, her mind distant. Downstairs, the fire crackled in the hearth, but it offered no comfort. The scent of coffee drifted faintly through the air, but she hadn't had a sip. The house felt unnervingly silent, as if it too knew that something was coming to an end. Daniel hadn't asked her to leave, but he also hadn't asked her to stay. And really, what was there to say? She zipped the suitcase, took a slow breath, and stepped into the hallway. The boys were playing in the living room, Roy reading quietly, while Joe flipped through a book, too restless to sit still. They looked so comfortable here, so at ease. For a brief moment, Linda hesitated. Then she reminded herself. This wasn't their home. She crouched beside them, smoothing Joe's hair, resting a hand on Roy's shoulder. "Boys," she murmured. Joe looked up first, his brows pulling together. "Are we going somewhere?" Linda forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart. The snow is clearing up so we can go home now." Roy frowned. "Already?" Joe twisted in place, looking toward the kitchen where Daniel had been last. "But we were supposed to watch the stars tonight." Linda swallowed. "I know, honey, but we need to get back." Roy's lips pressed together, his gaze shifting toward Daniel as he appeared in the doorway. The man looked tired, more than tired. His expression was unreadable, but his shoulders held the weight of something heavier than exhaustion. Joe jumped up, running toward him without hesitation. "Daniel, are we leaving?" Daniel knelt slightly to meet the boy's eyes, offering a small nod. "Yeah, bud." Joe's face scrunched. "But why? We like it here." Linda's throat tightened. She didn't expect this to hurt so much. Daniel hesitated, then ruffled the boy's hair. "It's just time, kid." Joe pouted but didn't argue. Instead, he lunged forward, wrapping his small arms around Daniel's neck. "Then we have to come back. Right, Roy?" Roy, usually the quieter one, stepped forward. His arms wrapped around Daniel's waist, clinging a little longer than his brother did. "You'll visit us?" he asked, voice muffled against the fabric of Daniel's shirt. Daniel stiffened just slightly, but then his hand came up, resting on the boy's back. "Yeah," he murmured. "Of course." Linda pressed a hand to her chest, blinking rapidly. She needed to get out of here before she changed her mind. The boys released Daniel, bounding toward their coats with the carelessness of youth, their grief not yet formed, their understanding of goodbyes still soft around the edges. Linda turned to Daniel. Their eyes met. This was the part she had been dreading the most. She gripped the handle of her suitcase, her knuckles turning white. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. Daniel nodded. He didn't speak for a moment, and when he did, his voice was rough. I'll send you the rest of the boys' things, if they left anything behind." Linda nodded. "All right." Another silence, one neither of them knew how to fill. Finally, Daniel exhaled. "Take care, Linda." She forced herself to smile, though it felt like a lie. "You too." Then she turned and walked out the door. The moment it clicked shut behind her, Daniel felt something in his chest pull tight, then snap. The silence left in their absence was unbearable. That night, Daniel stood in the middle of his living room, staring at the wall. The photos were still there. Charlotte's smile, frozen in time, hung in gilded frames, watching him from every corner of the house. He reached for the nearest one, fingers curling around the frame, and pulled it down. Then another, and another. One by one, he took them all down, his movements slow and deliberate. When he was done, he stood in the empty space where they had once been, breathing heavily, his hands trembling at his sides. Charlotte didn't deserve a place here anymore, and for the first time in 2 years, the house finally felt like his again. Linda's apartment was smaller than Daniel's house, but the moment she stepped inside, it felt heavier. The familiar creak of the floor beneath her boots, the faint scent of the lavender candle she had left half-burned on the counter, the cluttered shelves filled with children's books and scattered toys. It should have brought her comfort. Instead, it felt foreign. She stood by the door for a long moment, gripping the handle of her suitcase like an anchor, before finally forcing herself to move. Roy and Joe, on the other hand, adjusted immediately. They bounded into their bedroom, flopping onto their beds like they had never left, laughter spilling between them. Joe kicked his feet excitedly against the mattress. "It's not as soft as Daniel's house, but it's ours." Linda swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She forced a smile. "Yes, sweetheart, it's ours." The moment she said it, Her chest ached. She left them to settle in and made her way to her own bedroom. The space felt untouched, frozen in time, just like she had left it. But tonight, it felt smaller. The walls seemed closer. The bed, which had once felt like a place of rest, now felt cold. Without thinking, she walked to the closet and pulled open the door. Gerald's things were still there. His jackets, his shirts, clothes that had hung untouched for 2 years. His cologne sat on the dresser, dusted but still carrying his scent. She hesitated, staring at them as if they might suddenly explain themselves, as if they might tell her that she had been wrong. But the truth was already carved into her bones. The man she had loved, the man she had mourned, had never been just hers. Linda reached for the first shirt, pulled it from the hanger, and folded it carefully. Then another, and another. By the time she was finished, there was nothing left but an empty closet and a cardboard box filled with the remnants of a man she no longer knew. She closed the lid, exhaling. She wasn't crying. Not anymore. Some griefs burned like fire, but this one settled into something else, something quieter, heavier, final. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel had thought the silence would be comforting after Linda and the boys left, that it would bring back some semblance of normalcy. Instead, it pressed against him, thick and suffocating. The absence of their voices, their laughter, even the light patter of their footsteps on the hardwood floor. It was like an echo of something unfinished, something unresolved. For the first few days, he threw himself into work. Emails, meetings, reports. Anything to drown out the empty spaces they had left behind. He spent long hours in his office, barely stopping to eat, his mind desperate for distraction. But no matter how hard he worked, the quiet followed him. Every time he walked into the living room, he half expected to see Joe curled up on the couch, flipping through a book, or Roy staring at the telescope, asking about constellations. Every time he passed by the guest rooms, his chest tightened at the thought that they had once been filled with soft whispers and sleepy murmurs. And every time he turned toward the kitchen, he could almost hear Linda's voice, gentle but firm, calling for the boys, laughing at one of their jokes, asking Daniel if he wanted another cup of coffee. He had gotten used to them. And now they were gone. Daniel didn't know what it was, guilt, loneliness, something in between. But one evening, he found himself making a call. The investigator picked up on the second ring. "I need an address," Daniel said without preamble. There was a pause. "Linda Matthews's?" "Yes." Another pause, then a sigh. "You sure about that?" Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Just find it." The investigator didn't argue. A few days later, Daniel had what he needed, but he didn't know what to do with it. He didn't call her. He didn't text. He told himself it wasn't his place to interfere, that she had made her decision, that she had left because it was the right thing to do. But still, something pulled at him. So, one evening, without overthinking it, he drove to the address. The neighborhood was different from what he expected. Modest, a little worn, the buildings standing close together, their windows glowing with warm light. He spotted her apartment number easily enough, parked across the street, and sat there for a long time. He had planned on leaving the envelope anonymously, just a small sum, enough to make things easier for her and the boys. It wasn't charity. He knew Linda wouldn't accept that. But it was something, a gesture, a way to say, "I'm still here, even if we don't talk anymore." But before he could even step out of the car, movement caught his eye. A small face in the window. Roy. Daniel froze. The boy's eyes widened in recognition, and before Daniel could even think of looking away, Roy disappeared from view. A second later, the front door burst open. Daniel barely had time to react before Roy and Joe came barreling down the steps, their excitement radiating through the cold evening air. "Daniel!" Joe yelled, his voice bright, filled with the kind of joy that made Daniel's chest ache. And just like that, his plan of a quiet departure was ruined. The next thing he knew, Roy had grabbed his sleeve, tugging him toward the apartment. "Come inside." Daniel hesitated, glancing toward the open door, his heart hammering. And then, before he could think to stop himself, he let them pull him in. The apartment was nothing like Daniel's house. It was smaller, warmer, lived in. It lacked the towering ceilings and polished, untouched furniture of his home, but it was full in a way his house never was. It smelled of fresh laundry and something faintly sweet, maybe vanilla, maybe whatever candle Linda had left burning in the corner. The walls had scuff marks in places, the couch was well loved, and the kitchen table was cluttered with crayons and unfinished drawings. It wasn't perfect, but it felt real. Daniel stood in the doorway, uncertain, still caught off guard by the way the boys had dragged him inside. His hands were still cold from the night air, but in here, everything was warm. Linda was standing by the kitchen counter, her expression unreadable. He couldn't tell if she was surprised, annoyed, or something else entirely. "Daniel," she said, like she wasn't sure if he was real. He exhaled, feeling slightly ridiculous. He was outside," Joe announced proudly, bouncing on his heels. "We saw him from the window." Roy nodded, crossing his arms. He was probably gonna leave, but we caught him. Linda's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought she might tell the boys to go to their room, that this wasn't a conversation they should hear. But instead, something shifted in her expression, something that made the knot in Daniel's chest loosen just slightly. She sighed, shaking her head. "Well, since you're here, you might as well stay for dinner." Daniel blinked. "I don't—" Joe grabbed his hand before he could finish the sentence. "Come on, Mom made real food, not just toast." Roy smirked. "Yeah, do you even eat actual meals, Daniel?" Linda snorted, covering her mouth to hide her amusement, but Daniel caught it anyway. He let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he muttered. "I'll stay." The boys cheered, dragging him toward the small dining table where mismatched plates were already set. The room was tight, the chairs a little wobbly, but the second Linda placed a steaming plate in front of him. Something in his stomach twisted. It had been a long time since someone had cooked for him. They ate together, and for the first time in days, maybe even weeks, the past felt like it was staying exactly where it belonged. In the background. They didn't talk about Charlotte. They didn't talk about Gerald. They talked about Joe's school project, about how Roy had started reading a book about space because of Daniel's telescope. Linda asked how work was going, and Daniel found himself answering without hesitation. He told them about the ridiculous email chains that never seemed to end, the way people in his office tiptoed around him like he might snap. Linda smirked over her glass of water. "You do kind of have that effect on people." Daniel scoffed. "I do not." Roy nodded. "Yeah, you do." Joe stuffed a spoonful of mashed potatoes into his mouth and mumbled, "You're scary, but not scary." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That doesn't even make sense." Joe shrugged. "It does in my head." Linda laughed then, an actual, genuine laugh, and Daniel felt something shift in his chest. After dinner, the boys pulled him to the couch, forcing him to watch their favorite cartoon. Linda sat on the opposite end, curled up with a blanket, and though they didn't talk, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. The weight between them was still there, but it didn't feel as heavy. When the boys finally fell asleep, Joe snoring softly against Daniel's arm, Roy curled up with a book half fallen from his hands. Linda stood, stretching. Daniel carefully lifted Joe and carried him to his bed, tucking the blanket around him. Roy stirred slightly, but didn't wake as Linda adjusted his pillow. They met in the hallway after, their voices lower, softer. "I should probably go," Daniel said, rubbing the back of his neck. Linda nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes. "Yeah." Neither of them moved. After a beat, she exhaled. "Look, Daniel." He looked at her, waiting. She hesitated, then said, "You don't have to stay away." He blinked, caught off guard. Linda sighed. "The boys. They love you. And I know you didn't come here for them, but—" She glanced down the hall, toward their rooms. "They need people who care about them." Daniel swallowed. "And you." She met his eyes, and for a moment, he saw something unspoken there, something neither of them was ready to name. "I don't know yet," she admitted, honest and quiet. "But I don't want you to disappear. And good night, Mr. Livingston." Daniel let out a slow breath, his shoulders loosening. "Okay, my friend," he said. "Yes, friends in every sense." Linda left him a thick blanket and soft pillow in the living room. This house, perhaps this was the warmest moment in the past 2 years, even his villa. Daniel closed his eyes. Everything blurred, but the future was appearing. He felt something he hadn't in a long time. Like maybe, just maybe, Daniel was heading towards something worth holding on to. The morning came quietly. Daniel woke to the soft sound of movement in the kitchen, the clinking of plates, the gentle hum of a quiet conversation between Linda and the boys. For a moment he forgot where he was, the warmth of the blanket around him, the dim morning light filtering through the curtains. It was unfamiliar, yet strangely comforting. He sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. He hadn't slept this well in years. As he swung his legs over the edge of the couch, the scent of coffee drifted toward him. It wasn't the rich, dark roast he usually drank in his empty house. It was softer, lighter, the kind of coffee that made a home feel lived in. Joe was the first to spot him. The boy beamed, his mouth still full of toast, and waved enthusiastically. "Morning, Daniel." Roy, more composed, simply nodded in greeting. "We saved you some food." Daniel smiled, shaking off the last remnants of sleep. "Thanks, Bud." Linda turned from the stove, a knowing expression on her face. "Didn't expect to wake up here, did you?" Daniel exhaled, standing. "No, but I can't say I regret it." Linda only smirked and slid a mug of coffee across the counter toward him. He took it without hesitation, their fingers brushing briefly. It was a small moment, but something about it lingered. Breakfast was unhurried and easy. Joe and Roy bickered playfully over who got the last piece of toast. Linda scolded them half-heartedly while Daniel watched, amused by how effortlessly he'd been woven into their morning routine. But soon, reality pressed in. Daniel had to leave. The boys sensed it before he even said anything. Joe frowned as Daniel grabbed his coat, his small hands clutching the sleeve of Daniel's sweater. "You'll come back, right?" Daniel crouched to meet his gaze, ruffling his hair gently. "Yeah, kid, I'll be around." Joe squinted, as if assessing whether he believed him, then nodded solemnly. Roy stood beside his brother, hands in his pockets. "You don't have to just show up outside next time," he said matter-of-factly. Linda let out a soft laugh, and Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Noted." He turned to Linda then. She was already walking him toward the door, her expression unreadable. Outside, the cold nipped at their skin, but the sun had broken through the clouds, casting a pale golden glow over the snow-covered streets. Daniel lingered, gripping his car keys tightly. He had come here expecting to leave unseen, to drop off an envelope and disappear. But now, as he stood here, watching Linda tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, he realized that wasn't what he wanted anymore. He didn't know what came next. He didn't know if this was just friendship, or empathetic, or healing, or something deeper that neither of them was ready to name. But for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of the uncertainty. Linda's voice was soft when she finally spoke. "Next time, you don't need to stand outside." Daniel looked at her, waiting. She held his gaze, steady and sure. "We'll be waiting for you." His chest tightened, but not in the way it used to. This feeling, this warmth, was different. Daniel nodded. "All right." Linda offered him a small smile, a real one. He stepped toward his car, the boys running after him, waving as he opened the door. "Bye, Daniel," Joe called. Roy gave him a firm nod. "See you later." Daniel smirked. "See you later, bud." He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and for the first time in a long time, leaving didn't feel like an ending. As he drove off, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. Linda and the boys stood together on the snowy sidewalk, watching him go. And just like that, the future didn't seem so empty anymore. It wasn't closure. It was a beginning. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.